Welcome to Girl Take the Lead podcast, where each week we'll explore womanhood and leadership. And today we're going to look at it from different perspectives of different generations. So you have me, Yo, who is a boomer.
I'm Emma, the millennial.
And I'm Kiki, the Gen Z.
So we're going to explore a book today called Women and Power by Mary Bird. And this book was recommended by Emma when we first started talking about doing this podcast. So I've had a read of it and Emma's read it, and we're going to pull together some questions from the reading that we think you'll find interesting. Emma's going to kick us off, though, with just a quick synopsis of the book.
Yeah, and as a friendly reminder to our listeners, all this information will be in our show notes, so you can reference any thing we mentioned there. But Women in Power is actually, it's a small little manifesto consisting of 2 essays written by Mary Beard, who is a British classicist, meaning she does a lot she's an academic based in ancient Greek and Roman studies. She writes about sexism and misogyny, or like the kind of hate or distrust of women as a greater topic as it relates to Roman culture, but also how it relates to the modern day, which is kind of what we're going to focus on in our podcast. But this is field based on her own personal experiences with sexism within her academic life, and she's very frank about it. And I thought it was great because she really touches on like how the concept of power has a different definition for women than it does, I think, in general. And she kind of questions whether those broad socially accepted definition of power kind of applies for women because of the historical role that women have had as lacking power in society.
Right. So let's start with this first question, I think, from the book. She makes the point about conventional definitions of power. And if we look at how and why do conventional definitions of power, which might mean knowledge, expertise, and authority that we carry around in our heads that exclude women?
Well, I think I kind of touched, at least for me, it's just historically women have been excluded from social circles and political structures that give people power. So like, for example, like women were not allowed to own land like on their own until like at least in the US, and this is also specifically for like rich white women in the late 1800s, and just thinking about specifically white men have always had that privilege. I think for me, when we think about power, we think of like economic power, political power, and white women weren't allowed to vote until like the 1920s in the US, and even later for women of color. And so I think when I think of like traditional definitions of power, that's what I think of.
Okay, and maybe it has to do with the way that we recognize, female power. There's certainly different stereotypes that come up when we think about powerful women. Things like, it's a very masculine energy. It's not feminine. I think here's a quote from the book that she makes. Women are still perceived as belonging outside of power. Oh, wait, sorry, wrong quote. Let me go to the other one. To put this the other way around, we have no template for what a powerful woman looks like, except that she looks rather like a man. And in the book, she brings up Angela Merkel and Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth I. And, I can remember like thinking when I was in starting my career that wearing pants was such a strong statement, rather than wear a dress or a skirt and suit, that a pantsuit made me somehow more powerful. I don't know, I just realized just having that memory. But do we think that's changing? Do we think that women just have more options?
Like, what do you mean more options?
Like, it doesn't matter so much if you wear pants or a dress or whatever.
I definitely think there's more options now. Like when it comes to dress, I think, I don't know, a lot of women can wear a pantsuit and even just kind of have fun with their outfit or how they express themselves.
Yeah, but like even remember when Kamala wore her pantsuit with sneakers, right? We all went, wow, that's great. She doesn't have heels on, right? That she changed it up. And maybe fashion, I think, is much more open to us. So it's not a masculine statement.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, like, I don't know about you, Keith, but like at my workplace, like we can wear jeans, and like, cause like I work in tech, so like, you know, the casual dress code is kind of more the norm. And I mean, I feel like I would actually look out of place if I wore a dress or a skirt, just because like it's more formal. But
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, I think that would be more the thing rather than like the gender thing. I mean, yeah. But I remember when I worked at Cisco, I was an intern in their government affairs office. I was kind of the only one who was wearing a skirt as an intern, which kind of you know, I think kind of threw me off. But like at the same time, like I don't think people really think that far in my experience. Like no one really cares as long as you look nice, as long as you dress to the code, rather than like what exactly you're wearing. I mean, I wouldn't wear like bright colors, which like I don't know if that really has any particular tie to femininity nowadays, but it's kind of hard to say because fashion in the workplace has just changed that dramatically. It's kind of hard to say.
Another point she brings up is women in power are seen as breaking down barriers, or alternatively as taking something to which they are not quite entitled. And the examples she uses are knocking on the door, storming the citadel, smashing the glass ceiling, giving them a leg up. And that these metaphors are kind of showing us about women's access to power, which I thought was kind of interesting. I had never thought about, you know, smashing the glass ceiling before that way. But I guess it does reflect that when it is used, it is indicating that, you know, oh, there's a first, you know, a woman has broken through. Like if you look at sports, for example, that, you know, the big deal that was made that the Giants had a coach who was female, and that there's females now being on the court for refereeing games in basketball and also in football. So there, I guess until it gets to be that there isn't the first one or the only one, maybe we won't use these metaphors. Maybe these metaphors will go away.
Yeah.
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, like, I think they're just such a big part of like how we discuss like women's progress that I don't think it will ever really go away. But I think I know mom and I discussed this, Key, but I think like, you know, for me, like for the Gen Z and the millennial generations, like I was kind of thinking like, you know, the glass ceiling is already broken. Like when we think about like, you know, Title IX laws, for example, like ones governing like sexual harassment or equal treatment, like that was kind of the first step, right? That broke the glass ceiling in theory, but it's still like men are you know, we made it through the glass ceiling. We're now at the ground floor of a building and the men are on the 70th floor. And now we got to catch up. There's so many other systematic things that kind of get in the way for us to have like true equity and equality on par. And not to mention like the different intersections with other identities, such as like sexual orientation and race and class, you know. So I think it's kind of tough to say that those metaphors aren't accurate per se, but I think they just need to be kind of reinvented into something that's a little bit more relevant for these new generations.
Right, because you guys wouldn't use those terms, would you?
No, but definitely heard of them. Like familiar with them, but
yeah,
I don't really say it.
She also makes the point that along that line, which is it's tricky for us to judge a woman's success. And she uses some like at the very top in Rwanda, more than 60% of the members of the legislature are women. The UK at 30%. Actually, I went and just looked, and in our U.S. Congress, it's 27%. So over a quarter of of the members are women, and that's a 50% increase, versus a decade ago. So, do we judge that? I mean, is that what we think is successful is based on, just what we see here in terms of representation? And given if we define leadership as, making a difference, maybe the way we could look at this a little bit differently if we were going to look at success. If we shift the definition of leadership to be about taking action, having followers, making an influence, whether it's you have the authority or it's, kind of being something more virtual in terms of influencing others. If we look at it that way and we begin to judge success as, action that gets taken, that might be one way to kind of shift this paradigm a little bit.
Could you talk about it a little bit more?
Yeah, you might need to clarify a little bit.
Yeah, sometimes you see something and you're not sure that you've communicated it. If we say that we're all leaders, like let's start with that premise. Let's say we're all leaders. Then would you measure success of women as leaders by a percent of membership in Congress? Or could you measure it by women who are advocates, women who are leading and developing their voice? Women who are in families and primary breadwinners, women who, just what I'm saying, it's not just about an authority, like having reached, like when I started my career, the big deal was how much money you made. Like if you made over $100,000, you were like, whoa, that's a lot of money, and you judged yourself by how much money you made. And that was success. So I'm just bringing up the question, maybe there are different ways to measure success so that women are actually on the winning end of it.
This is where my economist brain would jump in and be like, well, sure, I think you can't get like a complete picture through statistics that captures every single realm of society. I feel like that's just that, like logistically, theoretically, more or less impossible. You can get a bunch of different statistics from different areas and then just kind of look at them in that areas. I think that's just kind of like, for example, like when we think of like the average income for women for every American household, and we think about that average, that just tells us how much women are making in their homes, right? Like, compared to who they live with. It doesn't tell you about like how it looks like, beyond that. And I think like you could frame things a different way and it will tell you a different story. To your point, I think, does representation in politics become the only definition of success that we can use? No, but it does. I think in the context of Beard's essay, she was talking about how it looks country to country and how it looks different.
Yeah.
And like from a political sphere, it does tell you that there's a difference between political attitudes for women as leaders, as politicians, sure, but at the same time, like there are so many other nuances to it, it's never going to be a complete picture.
This quote from the book, I think, captures exactly what you're saying, which is, but this is still treating power as something elite. This is treating power very narrowly as the object of possession that only the few, mostly men, can own or wield. On those terms, women are excluded from it. You cannot fit women into a structure that is already coded as male. You have to change the structure. This means thinking about power differently. It means decoupling it from public prestige. And see, that's what I was trying to bring forward about maybe it's not just about, and I think you're right. I think you have to have some kind of metric, right, to determine whether it's, moving in a direct, where the trends are. And if you're moving in a more positive direction. And I think this brings us to another point, which is she brings up the point about the popular resonance of mansplaining. And it kind of hits home, I think, that it feels like when a male is explaining something that they assume you don't know, that they're not taking the woman seriously. And I don't know, Emma, you had an experience where you were lectured over dinner in your field of policy, right? What was that about?
Yeah, so I, like many millennial women, go on dates through dating apps. And I happened to go on one date with this lovely person who seemed, I think he was genuinely a rocket scientist. He worked at NASA, I think, if I recall correctly. I had mentioned that as the listeners might already gander, I have a master's in public policy. And so I had mentioned this to him. And this is already during a date where things are not going right because he has not asked one question about me. And I am bestow on him facts about me, even though he did not ask. It's not a good going date. And then he kind of got into he was talking about politics. And I think like this is kind of one of those things where it's very niche to people who study politics, but he made a claim that was incorrect academically about certain political theories. And I was like, no, that's incorrect. And he's like, I don't think it is though. And then I was just like, I have expertise in this field. Because I knew in the moment, I was like, I just need to get out of here. I just need this date to be over.
Right. And there was no second date, right? There was
no, quite frankly, I blocked him immediately after I said goodbye. It's like, hey, this isn't going to work out, and just promptly blocked him.
But I think that what you were hitting, or the scene, is that it's the assumption that you wouldn't know.
Well, it's more, what was more insulting is that he didn't have faith in my own intelligence that I would know what I'm talking about.
Right.
And I think, or at least it was also the concept that he, even though he didn't know anything academically about this, he knew, like, if you look at it from like an academic perspective, he knew less than I did about politics. He assumed he knew more. And I was like, and I think that like bravado and sort of like almost like egocentric attitude towards it, like, is what was insulting, because you were disrespecting anything I have accomplished. And you're assuming that you are right and that you're correct. And you're dismissing when I say like, hey, you are wrong academically. And I cited like, no, and I explained why he was wrong in a very polite, like unassuming manner. Because it's one of those things where I'm like, I don't assume people would know this unless they actually studied it. And he just promptly shut it down, which I think when we think about like the structure, what you mentioned, like the system, the structural nature of power, I'm not going to win in that power structure, because how am I going to convince him he's wrong when he doesn't believe he could ever be wrong compared to a woman? I need to think about it differently. And I, find an alternative solution, which was being like, okay. And then like leaving him to his own devices and ending the date and having no further contact with him.
Right. Well, I think what I admired about the two of you when you were growing up was how you dismissed, even in grammar school and middle school, that you both kind of had this viewpoint, like, yeah, boys can be. They're not necessarily smarter than me. When I was growing up, I can remember my mother telling me that boys are smarter than girls. I didn't grow up with the vision that I could, be smart and attractive. And even now, when my best friend will say has told me, you were one of the smartest women I knew, I just never saw myself that way. Where the two of you have that capacity to see BS and call it. It's like, it's just so fun. It's so great to see it in the two of you. Like you just, let the person be. You weren't going to change him, so you didn't have a second date. You move on. And I think that's a big change from the way that I grew up. And when I got my MBA, I thought, I didn't look at that I accomplished an MBA. What I thought was that I struggled through getting my MBA, and it was from a good school, from USC. And I thought, I'm still not smart. I'm still not, there's just something about that power that has been socialized and, kind of drilled into us. And I think your generations are doing a much better job of questioning that. I mean, I think my generation had to almost go the opposite end and go into the streets and, the 60s and 70s of, and the Gloria Steinems leading the way and other feminists to help us see, we all belong.
Yeah, well, I think too, like Kiki and I were lucky. I mean, I don't know about you, Kiki, but the media we consumed when we were children also have women in general in leadership positions being the main characters of their own stories. Like those sort of representations that we consumed growing up, I think probably had an influence there. I mean, when we think comparatively to when you were a kid, that stuff did not exist and in the mainstream like media. And so I think as things changed, like the culture is just, it could just goes to show the culture changing is just as, and the norms changing is just as important as like the laws changing or the policy is changing, like because the added like shaping the attitudes of the newer generations is the only way we're gonna achieve any sense of progress or achievement or what.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right. Well, do you guys have a sense in your jobs, like in your work environments, that do you feel like you're listened to, and that if you're not, it's because maybe you don't have the experience, but that it's not because you're dismissed simply because you're a female?
I definitely don't feel that way with work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm new to my job. I've been there for 3 months and I don't think I'm ever really dismissed, but there are times, where it's just like, I'm still learning, and I've never felt because of my gender. And I mean, in my previous work, I worked at a nonprofit. It was like a majority women. We only had one or two guys on our team. So it was kind of a different dynamic there, but that's just my experience. I've never really felt that way.
Yeah, I think
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mom.
I think, Emma, you and I talked about this, that didn't you say you had mostly female bosses?
Yeah, I was doing the mental math in my head. Let's say I've had about like 10 positions, including internships. I think technically only one of my bosses was male. There was another male who was a co-boss with one of my other positions, but like he wasn't the person I reported to or signed off on my paychecks, And I think that I've been lucky too, because like a lot of those women have been women of color as well, which I think is another dimension to this whole like inclusion of women issue that is now being talked about more often in recent times, especially with like the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and Stop Asian Hate. I think those sort of movements have kind of, I mean, even before those movements jump started, but I think with the advancement of like diversity inclusion programs in corporations and other businesses, I think we're seeing more women of color also being empowered to pursue leadership positions within their own companies, which is very cool. And I've seen firsthand, it's cool. I think that's another change to make note of as well.
I think that's a great change for us to be optimistic. I mean, in the last position I had, when we brought in, different leaders to bring more diversity, more equality into the workplace, I thought that was just so great. You could be your culture. It was okay to say, you were Latina and you had this background or that background, and you grouped together. And that was just something that just gave me tremendous hope, because in my career, which for the listener, I ended 42 years just this past September. And I think the women leaders that I worked for, I think I am still friends with all but maybe a few of them I've lost contact with. And the male leaders that I had, I don't have that relationship with. And I always found it hard to be understood by them. They liked my insights and my competence and what I did, but it wasn't like we could be friends or, have a mutual respect outside of the workplace. Where my relationship with my women friends is something that we continue to help each other and bring up the other person, lift them up. So I have found more mentorship with my female bosses than I certainly have with my male bosses. I didn't find my male bosses to be opening the doors for me or helping me get higher positions in those jobs where I did with my female friends. Also optimistically, and to your point, Emma, about the metrics, there's a couple of things I found that I was just looking around, because we can find lots of metrics about how bad the situation is, but I thought it would be good to focus on some good ones. So we talked about the percent in Congress, There's a record number of women in college. Right now, the percent is 59.5% new of women going to college. So it's outnumbering men. Also, 64% of mothers are breadwinners. The primary, they're not the primary, but necessarily they include primary, sole, and co-contributors. It has definitely increased. And I think one of the other areas of optimism are the kind of benefits that you all are getting now in your jobs, like I didn't get. When I had a baby, I think I got 3 months and that was it, but now you get a lot more than that. It's like 6 or 7 months in some cases. So in California, I think you have to provide up to 12 weeks on top of the 4-month disability leave that you get. And then even just looking at the benefits the two of you have gotten in your jobs, I'm just like super jealous. Like, where were those when I was starting? Things like the wellness stipend, the childcare stipend. I'm like, could I have had those? This would have been great.
Mm-hmm.
But anything else that you guys can think of that make you optimistic about the future?
That's a good question.
I think I see more and more people, like in my generation at least, like using their voice to, because I think all of those stipends wouldn't have happened without, employees kind of speaking up about it and saying, this is really important to me, or I want to see this. So like continuing to use our voice, I think is really important. And I think something that will just improve, each generation, I hope. So those are my thoughts, at least.
That also reminds me too, I think also the inclusion of paternity leave as well, for at least like some of the companies I worked at. Like there's one company I worked for, I think women had like 9 months for maternity leave. And then their partners, or like if the father was working at the company, they could get like 4 months of paternity leave. That I thought was really cool, because then it's also recognizing that like, sure, women are mothers, that's cool, but like they're also being actively supported by their partners, which is very cool. And I think that attitude towards paternity leave being more of like a regular commonplace thing, I think is also kind of showing a change in the norms, which is something to look forward to.
So are there any key takeaways from today's episode? For me was the idea of questioning the metaphors, shattering the glass ceiling and things like that. That was really an interesting question for me and to consider and to think about.
Yeah, I think too, like kind of like the questioning the definition of power, I think was also kind of interesting, because with my background, I immediately go towards the economic and political spheres, but there's other ways to think about it too.
Yeah, I think for me, I kind of really appreciate and acknowledge all the generations before me that, kind of put in the work to kind of shatter that ceiling and create opportunities for, my generation to, be kind of more comfortable and, not, I think because of all that previous work, like people in my generation aren't as afraid to speak up about injustices or things that are kind of going on. So yeah, that's one of my takeaways. I'm really grateful for that.
Well, great. I feel the power shifting, knowing that the two of you are out there and listening to you guys talk. It's really nice to hear and to think about. There's lots to be optimistic about. So thank you, listeners, for joining us today. And we'll be back next week with another episode. And this is the Girl Take the Lead podcast. And we'll have information about us down in the notes. And you're welcome to contact us and join us on our Facebook group page called Girl Take the Lead, and ask us any questions and give us any suggestions. We're open to anything you have to say and would love to know more topics that you'd like for us to cover. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.